Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Muliani, for your given speech and the opening this morning here at the European time, obviously in the afternoon. And sorry for say so, Adrian O is with us meanwhile, and for him it's this evening. Adrian, thanks for joining us here from New Zealand. But I leave it up to my colleague and former founder of OMFIF Asia, Adam Cotter, who is now, and we have the pleasure with us at DZ Bank since early this year, but he still stays loyal to the OMFIF family, so as I do. He has a very interesting panel to moderate this morning for the APAC region. We have very passionate and famous people. I will not mention their names. That is up to Adam, but I'm very glad to see you all in good shape. And I do hope we come physically together rather sooner than later. Enjoy the day with us, and I'm looking forward for a really fruitful discussion over the next 1 hour. Thank you very much. Adam, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, and well, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening to all of you, and thanks for joining us today. As Frank said, my name is Adam Cotter from DZ Bank, and though I'm usually based in our Singapore office, I am today joining you all from our head office here in Frankfurt. So thanks for that introduction, Frank, and also many thanks to Sri Muliani for starting us off so well today. It comes now to me to guide the conversation somewhat more towards policy. We have three central bankers joining us in the next panel, especially in terms of monetary policy and innovation within the APAC region, and we'll be looking at the transition to a low carbon economy as well. Of course, considering varying climate-related changes to monetary policy is challenging due to the heterogeneity of central bank operations. So I hope we're able to also cover monetary policy's contributions to mitigating climate change, the effectiveness, I should say, sorry, as risk protection measures and how this works in practice. If time allows, I hope we can also hear from our panelists to see if there are any examples of best practice from their own institutions on greening or making more sustainable of prudential and monetary policies, or whether they've observed any lessons from other regions that can be drawn on by other APAC central banks as they build back better. We too have a former central banker joining who's now with a regional development bank, and that will also provide a chance to get some questions on investment, and especially the deepening of local currency denominated bonds and sustainability linked bonds in the region. So without further delay, let me briefly introduce our speakers, and forgive me for going lengthy introductions, but joining me are Chuchi Fonacia, Deputy Governor of the Banco Central and Filipinas, Adrian Orr, Governor of Reserve Bank of New Zealand, Seri Cha, Assistant Governor and Director General of Central Banking at the National Bank of Cambodia, and Satoru Tomoro Yamadera, Advisor of the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department at the Asian Development Bank. Good afternoon and evening to you all. So maybe I could start with Deputy Governor Chuchi. I hope you can hear me well and we can hear you, but perhaps we can go straight into the questions. And we can start by asking you, how can central banks and monetary policy support green and sustainable finance? And how do the institutions like central banks contribute to developments in the financial, or the greening of the financial system?
Yeah, thank you, Adam. So for us at the BSP, so cognizant of the risks and opportunities that come with climate change, as well as the safety and soundness concerns it could pose on individual financial institutions and the entire system, the BSP took a deliberate approach to issue the Sustainable Finance Framework in April of 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit its peak in the Philippines. So we believe that the issuance was timely as financial institutions reset their strategies in response to the pandemic, and it is just right to consider the ESG risks, including climate risk, in that exercise. So the framework sets out broad expectations on the integration of sustainability principles in the corporate governance, risk management systems, business strategies, and operations of banks. So one of the key elements of the framework is the vital role of the board of directors and senior management as they set the tone of good governance. And the board is expected to institutionalize the adoption of sustainability principles and promote a culture that fosters environmentally and socially responsible business practices. I think I'll stop there for now.
You're on mute, madam.
Thank you. That's an occupational hazard nowadays, isn't it? There we go. Thank you, Deputy Governor. We heard a lot from other central banks yesterday about the different policies being brought in by institutions like central banks. But it's good that we have a chance now to hear from different regions. There was a lot of European central banks, so I'm glad we have Southeast Asian and also Australasian central banks joining us. And then perhaps I can go over to Adrian to build on that question and ask really, how does the Reserve Bank of New Zealand view moving to greener or more sustainable monetary policy?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for inviting us onto the group. And you know, the Asia Pacific region truly need to be recognised, to shout out, to be loud on the topic. Very often we have, I suppose, in a sense, most to lose and the least set of tools to make a change on our own. So it's great to be part of this global forum, Adam and Frank. In terms of the central banks, I think I heard the word heterogeneous mentioned before. We are all very different in our core purpose, but I'd say what is common is a balance sheet that we have, a certain amount of respect or mana within the financial sector that we operate in, regulate, or provide the currency for. And so it's a matter of leveraging both the balance sheet and our regulatory roles, and I would say stewardship. And I agree with my colleague from the Philippines that stewardship role is really critical. When I look for what we are doing, well, first of all, it's around our own house, making sure our own house is in order. You can't throw stones in a glass house, so around our own carbon footprint, our own behaviour, our own structure. That is at the de minimis hygiene. Then it's about making sure around our actions, are they encouraging forward thinking around, I suppose, financial stability, which will be utterly impacted unless it's managed appropriately by the impacts of climate change. In that forward thinking, the interest rate is not the tool for managing the greening of the financial system. That is for managing overall aggregate demand, cyclical economic activity. But what we do around our foreign reserve management, what we expect around the collateral we might receive, around funding programs, particularly quantitative easing, the nature of the foreign exchange reserves, expectations we have around transparency, are all within a central bank remit while still sticking to our legislative purpose of low and stable inflation and employment. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand is in the fortunate position of having, which you'll find actually a lot in this region of the world, we are also still the prudential regulator of the financial system here. And so that gives us a lot of responsibility, but also tools outside of traditional monetary policy and the use of our balance sheet. So it's the regulatory tools, the macro-prudential tools, and just core prudential tools. How are financial institutions thinking about climate change risk in their overall assessment of their own lending portfolio? How are they providing advantages to things that will be sustainable, encouraging transition, and penalising bad current behaviours? So, we've seen a lot of actions from banks, investors around their own shop, but it's their own behaviours that most matter. And so, we are in a critical and important lead role, and we need to accept that and accept that it is an absolute core part of financial stability. It is within our remit.
Thank you, Adrian. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that issue of mandates, because obviously the mandates for central banks in Asia Pacific are quite different even between themselves, but vary differently to other parts of the world as well. Adrian, if I just stay with you, perhaps one more question. I know this whole sustainability issue is very close to your heart. Perhaps you may want to comment on the Reserve Bank's journey, especially since you've taken over the governorship in terms of supporting green and sustainable finance in New Zealand.
I would like to say New Zealand, we've been slow to the game. We've been slow to the game because of all the reasons of both tragedy of the commons, tragedy of the horizons. New Zealand has felt small, ineffective, and I suppose largely green from our starting positions. But that is no excuse to not play a global role, and certainly a regional role around representing and championing places that are even smaller with less resource capability capacity than our own. So the first one is a big wake-up call within the central bank that you cannot have financial stability if you have not priced in the risks and the behaviours of climate change, physical, transitional, all of the behaviours that you have been talking about and will understand. I won't repeat. The second bit is around leadership. You're not going to follow the doctor's advice if they're sitting there eating too much, drinking in front of you and smoking a cigarette. So, you've got to get yourself in shape and in order to provide that leadership, have that mana and command. And then what I'd say is, the kind of the trilogy of reasons why we are where we are with climate change. A central bank and its role in the whole of government is critical. Carbon pricing, carbon markets around greenhouse emissions, they are core to what we do as central banks: create markets, create transparency, create behaviour. So that's a very important part. Another part, of course, is the market failure around investing. Unless we are prepared to motivate and energise, create the catalyst for collective work, collective investment, the investment is not going to be made by any one individual. So that's where, we at the central bank, we have talked a lot, and from my previous life, managing a sovereign wealth fund, around that collective joint public-private partnerships and the roles that come with it. And I suppose the last and most important one that too many governments and central banks forget about, even though we rely on it, are the network effects. No one's going to buy an electric vehicle if there's nowhere to plug it into. And it won't matter how much cheaper electricity is or better it is than fuel if you can't refuel it. And so creating those, the environment for network economics and investments to go on are very much in the DNA of payment and settlement system structures, utility structures, all of what we do. So that awakening within the central bank has been, whilst it was recent, it has been across the board and is highly effective. But at the moment, we're still too much talk and too little do. And, we've got to do the do.
Thank you, Adrian. There was a lot of talk yesterday as well about carbon pricing, and I think it was Lee Bohr from the IMF said if we want a serious decarbonisation movement, we need to get the price right. So that's going to be a challenge for us in the coming months and years. Perhaps now I can move over to Assistant Governor Chair. Thank you for joining us. It would also be good to hear from you about the National Bank of Cambodia's journey in terms of supporting green and sustainable finance. But is there also a risk that these, not a change in mandate, but more increasing pressures on central banks to green monetary policy, as we heard from Adrian in other areas, is that overburdening central banks like the National Bank of Cambodia?
Well, thank you, Adam, for having me. I think in the context of the National Bank of Cambodia, we don't have that dilemma yet, because there's remained lack of green bond and green loan in domestic market for us to consider adding it to our monetary operations. Although we hope that soon it would change as the government and the central bank are stepping up effort in this area. For us, we're still at a very early stage, but we have supported sustainable finance through promoting capacity building in the banking industry. We will also be running a risk assessment of on the banking sector balance sheet to try to quantify the associated risk. And additionally, through our foreign exchange reserve management, we have allocated a portion that will go to green bond. But let me go back to the questions that you asked in terms of the risk of greening the monetary policy. And this is a question that went through our thought process when we were trying to initiate this. I think, first of all, it's like, as you mentioned, it's important to ask ourselves, what is the role of the central bank, and whether tackling climate change is something that the central bank should take on, and whether it will permit us to achieve our price stability more efficiently. And this is something that within the narrowly defined mission of the central bank that's given to us by the parliament, we have to consider this clearly. But of course, it has been recognized and accepted that climate change is a risk to the financial stability, but also to the price stability. So I think that for central bank will have to look at whether, by abandoning our market neutrality principle, by favoring green assets over others, whether we will favor in the open market operation, asset purchase, credit provision, reserve requirement, or even capital adequacy calculation, would it add on to our effectiveness in maintaining price stability and financial stability. And obviously, of course, this is the current practice of looking at assets from a liquidities and financial risk perspective. But I think, and I agree with the previous panel speakers, that it is everyone's responsibility to take on this ESG. It is us as a central bank to show and act as role model to the financial industry. And it's also us to, we're also responsible to look at how we have been defining the way we conduct our monetary policy. Should we also build into other factors beyond the liquidity and the financial risk part into our missions? And I've mentioned earlier about how we manage our foreign exchange reserve. Even though we're very keen in investing our foreign exchange reserve in the what we say the safe bonds or safe issuers of these bonds. The fact that safe issuers are mostly located in the developed country. And so as a developing country, because we lack of this kind of instrument, we therefore lending our scarce resources to this developed part of the world. And so I'm trying to see with my different partners, with different international organizations, how we can bring that scarce resource back to the to our region, to our country, because by definition, when we manage our foreign exchange reserve, liquidity and the ratings, this credit risk is very important, and that can only be found in this developed market. And so in this regard, this is a way that we're defining so narrowly our instrument that it's really sort of limit our role in doing more, or our willingness to do more in this area. But definitely, these are just the questions that we ask ourselves, and but the willingness is there, and we have already, as I mentioned, start something by working with the financial industry in capacity building, etc.
Thank you, Terry. Yeah, I think as more sovereign and SSA issuers, of course, issue more sustainable, linked and green assets, such as all the big issuances from the EU this year, the next generation bonds, central bank portfolios are inevitably going to become greener and more sustainable as well because of that. But as you say, I think central banks do have a very important place, given their sort of analytical capacity and the resources to hand to sort of guide the government in terms of green policy. But I agree that it shouldn't rest on the central banks to lead that change as well. Maybe because of you referenced the issue of the lack of green instruments in countries like Cambodia and Southeast Asia. Tomo, perhaps I can bring you in here. So it'd be good to get to get a regional perspective on the policies being undertaken to develop the sustainable finance market, and also how can we broaden the investor base in emerging Asia Pacific?
Okay, thank you, Adam. Thank you so much for the questions. Also, first of all, I'd like to express my appreciation for ONFI for inviting me and sharing the opportunity to express my thought. ADB is supporting our member countries in various ways, and I'd like to mention a few points in relation to the market developments, also the support to the sustainable finance. ADB is strongly committed to support this sustainable finance, and particularly in the context of recovery from the COVID-19, we emphasize the build back better. So we shouldn't go back to the original position, but our recovery process should be more sustainable and more resilient. And maybe we also need to introduce more sort of a technology in the process of the recovery. And in doing so, we emphasize the importance of a sort of a more greener, more cleaner energy transition. And that is really our part of the lending policy. So ADB is under the process of revising our energy policy. And also hopefully we can support the various recovery process under this the framework of sustainability. In that regard, I also would like to comment, of course, today's topic is sort of green. But in developing countries, we also face a lot of challenges. The policy priority is not only environment, and ADB also need to support various social issues. So in the context of the the recovery from COVID, we also need to think how we can support better healthcare, sanitation, also education, because now the school activity has stopped, so that we need to think how we can create more better environment. That is actually the challenge of the central banks in emerging markets. Not just the green, the central bank, if they want to step into the market and also intervene some sort of resource allocation through the market, they need to consider more aspect, more sort of variables in the process of a monetary policy. So that is really a difficult question, how central banks in emerging market can cope with these sort of issues and also support the recovery from COVID. It's not easy to find a good answer. Or at least in the process, we support, ADB is supporting the regional financial market developments, and particularly my team is supporting local currency bond market developments under the initiative called ABMI, Asian Bond Markets Initiative. So in that framework, we've been supporting, actually starting from the finding the potential green issue in the local currency, because there's a big gap. Now we see that lots of issuance, green bond issuance in the euro market, euro dollar market. But when it comes to the local currency, first we need to find issuer, and also we need to find investor. And then we also need to set up the appropriate or proper regulatory framework to support this sustainable finance. ADB has been working closely with the local regulators, starting from the drafting the necessary regulations, and also to create issuance. Just creating regulation is not enough. People often take the wait and see approach. So together with the market players, also regulators, we try to create a pilot issues. Currently, we are working on the pilot green bond issuance in Thailand, Indonesia, and Vietnam. Hopefully, we can make a good announcement soon. So these are sort of a hands-on support is critically important awareness, create awareness. High-level policy discussion is also very important. But when it to implement, also these hands-on support is, I would say, equally important. So I believe that's the role of a development bank.
Thank you, Tomo. Yeah, we're talking about frameworks. Maybe I can go back to DG Chuchi. The BSP recently announced its plan to introduce new policy measures related to climate change. Could you tell us a bit more about this framework that the Philippines has been working on?
Yeah, thank you, Adam. So a while ago, I described about how we have already issued a sustainable finance framework. And this will just be first of a series of sustainability or ESG related regulations to be issued by the BSP. So we have recently as well released the exposure draft of the guidelines setting out the expectations on the management of environmental and social risks in relation to credit and operational risks. So similar to other risk management guidelines of the BSP, we always emphasize the expectations on the board of directors and senior management as they set the tone of good governance. So in the exposure draft, we expect the board to set strategic environmental and social objectives for the bank's credit operations. And this may include progressively increasing targets on the proportion of the loan portfolio allocated for green or sustainable finance. And likewise, environmental and social risks factors should be considered in credit underwriting and loan pricing frameworks, as well as in determining allowance for credit losses. So with respect to management of environmental and social risks in relation to operational risk, we expect banks to conduct vulnerability assessment of its operations and systems and offices, branches to physical risk and other natural disaster events. So the results of the assessment may feed into the enhancement of business continuity plans. And we also expect bank management to identify environmental and social risks that may affect the performance of key personnel and officers as a potential operational risk trigger. So given the long-term adjustments needed to adapt the provisions of the proposed guidelines, banks will be given a transition period of 2 years. But meanwhile, we will also issue guidelines on the management of environmental and social risks in relation to the investment activities of the banks.
Thank you, Deputy Governor. So we're hearing from yourself and Tomo that there are a lot of positive steps being taken in the region. But Seri, if I could come back to you. Obviously, as Adrian alluded to earlier on, APAC region has a lot of climate-related pressures, and they're only going to intensify in the coming years. So how do regions like ASEAN and other emerging markets like the Pacific avoid being shut out of sustainable finance? And do you think there's anything that can be done to ensure that sustainable finance is widely accessible to all?
Yeah, I think first we have to, I have to mention that Cambodia, and I think many countries in the Pacific are negative emitter of CO2. And so our effort is not on the reduction of the emissions, but rather on the mitigation of the climate impact. But tackling climate change will require serious funding, and developing countries that are financially battered by COVID-19 are going to find it a lot harder to allocate funding to these pressing issues. Just an example, the total financing required for Cambodia to realize its national NDC mitigation target is approximately $5.8 billion US. with forestry comprising 60% of the total. The adaptation financing requirement are estimated at $2 billion, predominantly spread across infrastructure, agriculture, water resources, and livelihood, poverty, and biodiversity action. But as I mentioned earlier, we need everyone's attention on these issues. The blended approach, which is a blend of government, philanthropic, and private sector funding, and it is to Adrian's point of working together with whoever we can, could be a solution to this financing gap that we desperately need. Recently, under the stewardship of the government of Indonesia, the Blended Finance and Innovation Institute is going to be established, and what they're trying to do is to provide best practices, build capacity, and provide accelerating pipeline development across target area to overcome the sustainable financing. Also, as a region, as I mentioned, we are so diverse, and what we're also going to be needing for understanding purposes is a common sustainable finance taxonomy, which the ASEAN is currently working and hopefully be launching in November, and a taxonomy that is consistent with the international standard and accepted by the international investor. And so, of course, this will definitely make it a lot easier for investors to identify the eligible projects for us to raise the funding needed. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you. So, well, Adrian, it'd be great to ask you the same question, really, if there's any specific things about the Pacific region.
Yeah, I mean, the sake of to avoid being repetitive, in terms of the Pacific Island nations themselves, and I'll put Aotearoa and New Zealand in there at the bigger end. Capacity and capability is a real challenge, and we're talking around, and a colleague from Cambodia as well. Sheree was, saying that we to get lost in the complexity of applying and receiving for some of the international agencies' funding, even the capability to have the accreditation, have the programs ready, have the paperwork filled out, have the time and allocation. It's just not going to happen in the absence of capability and capacity coming with it, or in the absence of having country target limits, regional target limits for receiving this type of capital. We're being put up into a race that we will lose, and we will be out of the line of sight. I'll go back to Willie Brandt in terms of the North and South divide right back in the 1980s. Nothing's really changed. So, I'm so proud of our Asian Development Bank efforts around there. Well done, but we are still so far behind. So, what role can we play this region of the world to assist globally? We had Greta, a single person with a flag up saying we need to do something about this. We have Tuvalu, a small island nation state out in the middle of the Pacific, probably one of the first to disappear if we get this wrong. One of the first to feel all of the impacts of what everyone else is talking about. So being poster child of what can happen and how we can turn it around and what can succeed. Think about some of our areas of the world to show that this can truly matter. Simplify a lot of the international complexity. As soon as bureaucracy gets involved, which is important, it gets complex, it gets slowed, and no one even ends up wanting to play. And then having trust between the parties, between public sector bureaucracy and private sector balance sheets to work together. And that involves trust in the room. So doing some things partially right is better than doing nothing perfectly. So getting some of these trust activities going. So capability, capacity are critical. Use some of these countries as real examples of success. I think of Fiji around green bonds and blue bonds, ocean bonds, fantastic stories that would have not been heard about anywhere else. Get these programs up and running, use these as poster childs of what can be done on the way through. And I'll just finish that last plea. Our balance sheets we talk about as central banks are government balance sheets. Government balance sheets are not going to be sufficient or probably even be able to be prioritised towards future climate change issues. So government balance sheets and the rule of law and regulation need to be thinking about how can they unleash all of that private sector capital, which is more than sufficient to deal with these issues. When I look at the deadweight amount of capital sitting around the world in passive funds with people unincentivized to create this deal opportunity, that is the global tragedy. And we as central banks need to be working with every other regulator in the world how to unlock and get that trust in the room. Are we, first loss recipients? Are we insurance providers? What role can we play to unlock the vast bulk of the capital?
Thank you, Adrian. Well, I must go to Tomo after all of that, because you referenced the ADB, but of course institutions like the development banks have a role to play in unleashing private finance, as you said. And it's good that there are poster children or poster child sort of activities happening, like you said, in Fiji. And it really, I suppose, focuses the mind on the importance of developing these long-term local currency, sustainable, green, blue, social transition type bond markets. And these are going to really help emerging markets navigate the growth post-pandemic, as well as I think the differences in recovery post-pandemic are only going to widen that difference between the north and south, as you said, Adrian. So Tomo, how important is it to developing long-term local currency, sustainable green and bond markets in APAC? And tell us what's been going on in the region in terms of that.
Okay, thank you. Well, development of a local currency bond market relates to the development of financial market and depth of each financial market, and it takes long time. Well, I would like to emphasize a bit of a regional effort because it's also unique in a sense how different market, of which the market development level is quite different, but they come together and try to produce the kind of a common approach. I mean, the Asia is not like Europe, quite heterogeneous. And I think you need to understand that the Asia is quite different from Europe. But particularly, I'd like to emphasize the effort by ASEAN, I think DG Tutsi and also Assistant Governor Sarah mentioned the regional effort. Soon after the ICMA issued the various principles for green, social and sustainability and principles, ASEAN Capital Market Forum issued the green bond, social bond, and sustainability bond standard. And currently ASEAN collectively is discussing the taxonomy. As Madam Seri explained, this is going to be very much in line with the global practice, but that's also the kind of a manifesto of the region. So showing that their willingness to contribute to the discussion and align with the global best practice. Of course, as I said, when it comes to the actual implementation, we need to observe the different level of the market developments. But I would like to emphasize that this kind of a collective action is quite important, as the governor already mentioned. This is kind of a issue of public good and common, sort of a tragedy of common. But establishing a common recognition is quite important. And in that regard, ASEAN is really making a lot of efforts. The challenge is, as also Governor already mentioned, that the capacity and the different market has a different capacity. Like Singapore may be able to attract global funds and maybe channel to Asia, but still it's a big gap. So that we need to demonstrate that the function of each market can work. Of course, there are local issues. For example, ASEAN countries may feel that they are open countries, but they're quite vulnerable to volatile capital flows. So they may want to control their market and they may want to segregate the local market from offshore market. I would say that's a kind of a legitimate approach. Having said, to introduce foreign capital into local market development, we need to think how those how those funds can comfortably flow into local markets. And there are a lot of technical issues that ADB is really supporting, starting from the creating the bond market guide to explain in each market in a comparable manner. And step by step, one by one, I would say the ASEAN is going to be really fully integrated into the global capital market. And of course, this sustainable finance market. Again, we also need to understand that the situation is different and we need to customize the approach. That's the challenge, but I'm rather optimistic that the ASEAN countries' markets are quickly catching up. So we also see the growth of local investors. Previously, they didn't pay much attention to the sustainable issues, but now they are paying more attention. So I would say simply a matter of time. But again, we also need to be a bit patient because the policy priority is more complex in the developing countries than the developed market. Not just green, social, healthcare, education, sanitation. These are equally important as green. And the central banks need to juggle how to allocate, the resources in a proper manner. So that's the point. And also, actually, the Asian countries, particularly Pacific and also the Philippines as well, they are the ones who are affected by the climate change. They are more vulnerable. They are victims, not the creating the cause, but they are affected. So that I think some sort of fair promotion and assessment may be necessary to promote the sustainable finance in developing countries. Thank you.
Thanks, Tommy. I think the capacity issue will be a difficult one. And there's, of course, issues with labeling in Asia-Pacific emerging markets, and there's a lot of perceived costs that come with these instruments as well. So you mentioned, obviously, it goes way beyond green. Could something like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals be applied as some sort of positive impact framework? I was thinking that many bonds, particularly those issued by municipalities and sovereigns and supranationals, already display sustainable characteristics, be it healthcare, education, or water and things like that. Is that something that could be developed in the region? I know there are limitations on supranational and different municipalities on accessing capital markets, but is this something worth exploring further, do you think?
Yeah, Adam, that's exactly what is happening in Asia. Our research on the social bond market. Actually, last year, Asia, the social bond growth was far much bigger than, the growth rate was far much bigger than the green. And the size is getting bigger and bigger. And that really shows the interest of sustainable finance in general, not just green, but sustainability, social. These are quite important issue in Asia. I'm not saying that we should not pay attention to the green. Simply sustainable finance, sustainable bond, sustainability bond in general is really becoming kind of a trend of the market. And to be honest, 2 years ago, when we discussed green, the attitude of investors was quite skeptical. But these days, it's really changing. And also, I'd like to emphasize, because the global discussion really putting the pressure in the manufacturing sector, and also the factories, global supply chain network, they really need to pay attention to these environment issues. And as you know, Asia is really the base of the product. And then they are paying attention, and they are requested under the supply chain to make some sort of actual reduction. So now, particularly this year, I received more inquiries from the potential issuers. So things are happening. things are changing. But simply, we need to make sure the capacity can go together. Otherwise, it's not easy to create a market.
Oh, well, you've got a lot to do then, Tomo, in terms of capacity. But going back to DG Chuchi, we heard there was a lot of skepticism from Asian investors about green, but also sustainability-linked instruments. Do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought a sense of urgency to private sector investments into the SDGs in the region? And is this something that you're seeing in the Philippines?
Yeah, actually, even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic and our issuance of the Sustainable Finance Framework, there are already actually large banks which have started aligning their actions and activities with that of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we observed that these banks are disclosing in their published sustainability reports their contributions to the attainment of the UN SDGs. Likewise, there are banks that have established specific lending desks, encouraging enterprises to invest in renewable energy or energy efficiency solutions, while some have formulated green financing programs targeting specific sectors like the micro, small, and medium enterprises, and also even local government units. So what is also worth sharing is that the Philippine Bank's participation in the growing green bond market. So in particular, banks have issued green, social, and sustainability bonds aggregating to $1.15 billion in foreign currency denominated bonds and 85.4 billion pesos in local currency denominated bonds. So during the pandemic, actually 2 banks have issued social bonds aggregating to 29 billion pesos, targeting the micro, small, and medium enterprises sector, which serves as the backbone of the Philippine economy. And we are also seeing an increased uptake on financing sustainable projects. So based on our banking sector outlook survey among bank presidents and chief executive officers, only 30.3% of them were interested in financing sustainable projects. That's in the year 2019. But the number of interested banks actually rose to 71.3% in the first half of this year, 2021. So that's a huge interest from 30 to now 71.
Thank you, DG Chuchi. Well, there does seem to be a monumental change then in the thinking. Seri, does there need to be some sort of development in these sustainable instruments to customize or to be customized for the sort of Asian and ASEAN markets? And do you think maybe a more integrated ASEAN bond market could spur innovation and development of green and sustainable finance?
I think there's some reason why we would need a customized product for the ASEAN region. One is back to Tomo-san mentioned is that the word sustainability is understood very narrowly for a lot of people. So we think sustainability, climate change. But there are so many other factors that we need to take into account, like health, poverty reduction, etc. So this is something that we need to think, and that's why the taxonomy is going to be coming in very handy. So one, if we were to think about a hydropower project, right? So if you take the box of green financing, and then it would be, fully, it will pass. But then if you look at what is hydro, because you're actually moving from fossil fuel to renewable energy, but if you look what does hydropower do to the livelihood of the people who rely on, the water way of this, then we'll do something else. So this is something that it needs to be very specific, unlike in developed country where mostly the challenge is climate change. But for developing country, there's a lot of factors that need to take into consideration. The second point I think we need customization is that the ASEAN country or ASEAN regions are very bank centric. And we have seen that we hear a lot of the financing solution through green, ESG or SDG bond issuance investment, but it's go less through the bank loans or private credit. So I think that ASEAN Bank here also need to take more initiative to be innovative in both sourcings and providing funding in green project, rather than us being solely reliant on capital markets. In Cambodia, we are working to channel some of the available funding through the banks. And, after all, Tomo-san know that our capital market is still very small, nascent. And so we are also working on green loan standard at the moment. There used to be buzzword of green bank, although it's less in the public spotlight, but it is definitely something that every country in the region should still explore and consider. So this is my comments on the customizations of the green financing, of sustainable financing.
Thank you, Sarah. We're drawing to the end of the panel. We've got quite a few minutes left, but I want to go back. Adrian, you made a point about, I suppose, giving different regions of the world a voice in terms of making sure no one is left out. So how can we ensure places like the Pacific and ASEAN and their unique circumstances are communicated at international platforms?
Yeah, great question, and thank you for coming back for it. I suppose, we can't sit here and just ourselves and just think, gee, I wish people would remember we're here. We need to use every avenue that we have coming from this region of the world, which is why some of the networks that we have developed ourselves, one of the networks that we are highly engaged in at the central bank is the EMEAP group, which has 11 central banks from China in the north to us in the south. Our regional groups, but also connected very strongly into, I suppose, industry or regulatory groups, and speaking very loud about that. The network for the greening of the financial system, as you well know, I mean, the Europeans have been very good for getting this established, but we ourselves need to be important parts of that. The more that we also in this region of the world can, as we talked about, I suppose it's what level of bespoke treatment do we need versus how can we aggregate and create scale and investable opportunities for global capital. And so these, the Asian Index Bond Fund initiatives, which are now close to 20 years old, were originally US dollar denominated, now increasingly local currency denominated. We're working on more waves of that. It's about making sure that they make it on to the big indices. Countries are asked, why aren't they sitting in these indices? We are trying to remove, rather than make global investors be more energized, take a bigger effort to find out where their capital goes, we're trying to reduce the barriers to capital flowing to our regions of the world. So it's about joining the network, shouting out, reducing the barriers, creating aggregate investable opportunities. That is where I come back to the IFI and the IFI, International Financial Institutions, the ADBs, the IMFs of the world. Less competition amongst the IFIs and more working together, I think, is critical as well. It's very frustrating at a country end where great ideas are held up because it's not quite invented by the relevant international financial institution. So you folk need to be more comfortable about that and around achieving those roles. So I think shouting from the rooftop, everything that Cherie was just talking about, you should be out there championing Cambodia as a leading, nation state on these areas. And Adam, you should be continuously blogging about us.
Oh, well, for my adopted region, I will do that, certainly.
Well done.
So we've got some questions coming in. One is about sort of the latest developments in terms of reporting and disclosure frameworks, especially within the ASEAN region. So, Seri, this goes back to your earlier point, where there are, of course, at a regional and also country level, frameworks being defined in terms of green loans and bond principles. I mean, perhaps you could, if there is more you want to share on that in the Cambodia sense, but also what may be different for Cambodia, for example, other countries when they're looking to define these principles. Oh, sorry, I think you're on mute.
The ASEAN level, there has been the ASEAN Sustainable Banking Principle that was endorsed by the central bank governors. Principle covers two important aspects. It's on risk management, so integrating environment, climate-related social and government risk into financing and investment consideration. There's also business opportunities to support financing and investments in business that are sustainable, environmentally friendly, and socially responsible. In terms of the reporting, I think the issuance of the taxonomy would be a catalyst for this to happen. I don't know if Tomo-san know anything more than I do, but definitely to be able to define something, you have to be able to read the same meaning across the different jurisdictions. So I can't say something green in Cambodia, but it means nothing if you go to, say, the Philippines, right? So the taxonomy will be very important. Tomo-san, do you know anything else about this?
Well, to me, at least in ASEAN, in terms of the green taxonomy, I think there's not much different from the global taxonomy. It's quite common. And when we create the local currency, green bond, we need to get the verifier to verify our comply with the, for example, like a CBI, Climate Bond Initiative guidelines and so forth. So in terms of the process, the same. Well, maybe a difference in the disclosure in terms of the financial statement, but also ADB is promoting the common approach, regional common approach called the ASEAN +3 multi-currency bond issuance framework, which is the same, what we call it the document single submission form. Actually, so document in Cambodia can be used in the Philippines, or Philippine document can be used in Cambodia if the issuer follows the our proposal. So I wouldn't see much difference. So it's very much following the global standard, I would say.
Thank you, Tomo. DG Chuchi, we're just coming to the end of the panel, but I've got maybe one more question for you and a couple of others. Something you mentioned was this change in investor preferences from the banks, but something else we're witnessing in ASEAN is we're really on a cusp of a major intergenerational transfer of wealth from a lot of the older families who started up businesses. Of course, in many Asian countries like the Philippines, family business dominates, and we're going to see a transfer of wealth to millennials who are more likely to invest. There's obviously a generalization on my part, but tend to be likely to invest and be more concerned about the impact of their investments. So do you think the financial markets in ASEAN and Asia are ready to serve this change in investor demand?
Yeah, actually in Asia, the amount of wealth to be transitioned to the next generation is estimated at $5 trillion. And according to a study, most of the younger generations of Asian wealthy families are often digital natives and open-minded in pursuing new businesses, or even those with social impacts. So based on a study conducted in Sweden, younger generation of investors prefer to invest in green bonds compared to their older counterparts. So in the Philippines, a number of conglomerates are now being run by second or third generation siblings or family members. And we also observed that there are conglomerates that the pursuit of sustainability principles is not confined to the banks, but also in other companies in the group. So on the policy side, regulators should provide an enabling environment to accommodate the shift in investment preferences of younger generations. So financial institutions may also design their financial products and services that integrate ESG considerations and offer the same through secured digital channels. So in the case of the Philippines, the Securities and Exchange Commission has released the guidelines for the issuance of green, social, and sustainability bonds that are aligned with the ASEAN standards and the ICMA principles. And moreover, the SEC has issued the sustainability reporting guidelines for publicly listed companies. And through these regulations, financial institutions are enabled to offer new sustainable finance instruments and disclose information that would attract increasing number of investors who are inclined on impactful or ESG investing. So that's the development currently here in the Philippines.
Thank you, DG Chuchi. Well, we have come up to the end of our allotted time. I had hoped to ask all of you sort of what keeps you awake at night in terms of greening your financial markets in each country, but you've avoided that question. So I'd just like to thank you all for taking the time in the evening in New Zealand and the afternoon in Southeast Asia. And from me here in the morning in Frankfurt, thank you all for your time. It was great to have a diverse group of institutions speaking and to hear from a different part of the world after we'd heard a lot from European central banks on the first day. So thank you very much for that. Now we're going to move on to our next session, which is going to be from now until 10, and it's a conversation with John Morton, the United States Treasury and Climate Action. John Morton is the counselor to the Secretary of the US Department of the Treasury, and Mark Sobel, US Chair of OMFIF, will be speaking to him shortly.